something about this, and
Sorry about that. I'm the substitute tech. I apologize.
like a god moment.
That's right, yeah.
No, wait. I don't know where I was. So to be the front door to facilitate. Oh, I was working on something and I remember I couldn't figure out. I went to the UVM website and I had no idea. And the only way it worked was like that. The network, right? It was the informal network. Somebody I knew a faculty member and made the connection with, and I'm still connected with. But part of our job is to make that easier for people and to be present around the state. That was another piece of feedback I remember hearing about UVM. Is that the power on the hill kind of a thing, which frankly was kind of true. I experienced that when I was out, especially outside of Chittenden County and the 89 corridor between Montpelier and Burlington. So you get into the Northeast Kingdom or Brattleboro and Bennington, and people are kind of like, UVM doesn't care. Now, that's not all together true. And partly the other thing too is I have a marketing and sales background. So I think UVM and Extension, frankly, they didn't do a great job talking about it either, because faculty have been doing projects out in communities forever, but don't know about it. So part of that is just telling the story a little bit better. And also though, being present. I remember we were at a economic conference last fall, and we had, I think, 5 members of the UVM team were there. One of them was a former member, one was a speaker. And it was really interesting because people noticed. They're like, oh wow, UVM's here. Because people from UVM typically weren't there. And so sometimes just being present really matters. Got it. And the other thing we do that started with the Office of Engagement is we do data services for entities in the state. So our staff member, PhD student, union organizer, super smart civic data engagement, MSFET, uses data sets to help inform local community organizations about help them prioritize their development goals. She runs reports. We run reports annually for all the regional development corporations around the state to kind of give them some data about like the jobs market and things that they can use to kind of be a reference point as they're thinking about their plans going forward. And there we go. So what's launching the next phase is of the Office of Engagement is the Leahy Institute. And I forgot to add Leahy to the front of that. Just put Leahy in front of everything. He's doing like victory laps. Actually, I'm really lucky. My office in the newly renovated Hills building is literally across the hall from his office. Although he's kind of around the corner and stuff, but super. I mean, he's so chill. It's funny. I'm like sitting there talking to like this senator who's kind of a legend, and it's like no big deal. I had my kids there the other day, and he was there with Marcel, and they were just super. Of course, it was like grandkids, so they were just chit chatting, and my sons are kind of like. So we got about $14 million from the USDA NIFA, which is the National Institute for Food and Agriculture, to start an Institute for Rural Partnerships. So it's kind of building on the Office of Engagement mission of being out across the community, but now there's some money behind it. So community organizations could be Rotary, could be a startup, could be a municipal government, could be a small nonprofit, could be an indigenous group, whatever, that's partnered with a UVM resource, which could be a faculty member, could be student internships, could be using a lab space, things that require some capital to apply for some funding for whatever they're working on. So the idea is to put some resources behind those partnerships so that it makes them a little more maybe likely to go do something. Right now it's kind of the introductions I make are still good. Like, I live in Heinsberg and we have this old vestry building that a community group is trying to figure out if it's preservable, what are we going to do with it? I mean, it's literally like, falling into the ground. And I connected them with some of our civil engineering faculty because they do capstone projects where they have student resources that work with community groups that don't have a budget and do structural analysis and try to figure out what's going on. So even though we didn't have grant funding for that, it's still aligned with the teaching portion of it. So it worked out. We also have a project going on with Cabot between another researcher looking at their wastewater from their cheese production and trying to figure out how do they treat it in a way that right now they have to truck it to all these farms to spread it out as fertilizer. And the challenge is they have to go farther and farther to find farms to basically dump this stuff. So how do we figure out what to do it differently? So that's launching tomorrow. And there'll be an opportunity for interested organizations to submit letters of interest before applying. There's also going to be some like informational sessions about like what is this, how does this work, like what's a partnership, because you know that's usually what happens. You have a new grant program, people have tons of questions about how does it really work. And we hired in a woman who did this work with the American Red Cross down in New Jersey, which is great because this is her jam. You know, she's like developing the metrics, like how do we report out and what does the USDA need to see, right, for reporting. So it's really exciting. And this is a little detail. The grants go from 10 grand up to 300K. Sorry, the text is really small. Data services, partnerships, student engagement. I totally glossed that over. Kristen would smack me. Kristen Andrews is our internship coordinator, and Susan Moncrief is our Center for Community Learning. And the idea is getting students out into different places across the state, either in internships or in a little more, I guess, in depth. So the Center for Community Engaged Learning is more like a deeper project than like an internship. An internship might be kind of something that could be pretty simple, whereas the Community Engaged Learning is kind of going deeper with that organization and integrating it into the curriculum with students. We also launched last summer, we had our first RISE Summit, which was innovation, sustainability, and entrepreneurship. Rural innovation, sustainability, and entrepreneurship. That was last summer. That's going to be a repeating event. And it's kind of part of the rural partnerships funding where we're trying to bring leaders together around these topics and create collisions where you have people that may not be connected, get connected and come up with interesting solutions and ideas. I think, you know, what's been interesting, just thinking of UVM, and to be clear too, I'm also not speaking for the institution. You know, the institution of UVM is kind of an interesting animal because it's multi, you know, there's hierarchy, but there's a pretty robust political economy between the different schools and colleges and institutes and faculty research. They do their own thing. So as much as there's an institution, there's a lot of little different pieces within it. Connections. But what I have noticed, and what I've heard from people outside, is that when the President Garamella came in, and again speaking from my experience, there was also some changes in other leadership. So we got a new VP of research, Kirk Dombrowski, who is kind of 180 degrees from the previous VP of research. The new VP of research is very entrepreneurial, throwing stuff against the wall like nonstop to see what's going to stick, and it's really changed the culture. You know, our research funding has, I think, doubled in the last 3 years. Our office is within the Vice President of Research's office. So we've launched a couple, our new institute's getting going. We have a new institute for agroecology. We've just become really much more engaged externally especially in economic development. And we've also had new leadership in professional and continuing education. We have new leadership in the foundation. There's new leadership in strategic communications. I think we have new leadership in HR. That's relatively recent. Who else am I missing? So that there's been a pretty significant turnover in a good way. I think the previous president retired. And I think that's his typical in some large organizations. A lot of the people that are in kind of the next tier, so to speak, retire. It's like a cohort. That happens in the private sector too. I remember companies I used to call on as a salesperson. You have the CEO would retire, and then kind of the home vice presidents would retire, and then do kind of a succession plan. But in my brief, I'm mentioning that I think it's really a good thing for UVM's kind of role in the state. I think thinking differently about how is the institution functioning within Vermont and helping, lift the economy. So the latest kind of big news related to economic development is so the US EDA has, I want to say it's $10 billion, of which they've appropriated 500 million, probably getting that, to create tech hubs around the country. And the idea is to spur innovation around the country in typically areas that aren't considered like, hotbeds of innovation, like Boston, Silicon Valley, New York, the typical kind of clusters. And so we applied for designation a few months ago in collaboration with Essex Junction, Global Foundries in Essex Junction, around gallium nitride semiconductor technology, which I'm not going to bore you with because I'm probably going to mess it up anyway. But anybody that has a chemistry background might know about. Essentially, it's a new technology for semiconductors that the industry is kind of moving toward because it's more efficient. It can handle higher power. So all this energy conversion work that's going on with electric vehicles and different renewable energy projects, it's really a good, and even data centers and industrial PCs. I mean, chips are in everything. It's kind of a really big potential for the industry. And so we partnered with Global Foundries, the state of Vermont, other small companies around this designation. So we received the designation a few weeks ago. So that means we basically made it through the first phase of getting up to $75 million with this regional initiative. And it's kind of a big deal. There were 400 applicants and there were 31 tech hubs. So that's like 7%. So we made the cut, which is kind of a big deal. We just had our kickoff meeting last Friday, and we have a new regional innovation officer named Doug Merrill, who has a wealth of information in the tech startup space in semi-probe, and we're still, we're kind of like planning out the next phase for the next application. So if you know anybody that's in the tech space and the term gallium nitride means anything, that said, we're also, when you look at what the EDA is trying to do, and this ties into our work at VLI, is when you think about these regional innovation initiatives, you look at other places that have, quote unquote, been successful. There's also some pretty big social problems, right? Housing affordability, homelessness, despair. So how do we're trying to think about, okay, we're doing this tech hub and we're focused on the innovation around the private sector, but how do we bring in the Vermont Housing Conservation Board and Recovery Vermont and other organizations that are essentially kind of, dealing with some of the social problems we're experiencing. So you're thinking about that at the beginning, as you're thinking about an innovation ecosystem. How do you think about the housing problem as you're planning innovation in the regional context? So hopefully we can bring that perspective in and kind of avoid exacerbating some of the problems that we already have. Housing is already challenging. When we had our kickoff meeting, guess what? That was the first, we did like a word cloud of all things people think about housing, the homes, where are the people that are in those homes going to live? So it's something that we have to think about holistically in this context. And when you dig into what the EDA is looking for, they talk about that. They talk about like trying to bring in different organizations that have these perspectives. So it's not just about the private sector. So the other thing that I'm kind of involved with is in Vermont is the Vermont Prosperity Project, which launched in April. Essentially, kind of building off the comments about the tech hub, it's a initiative. It's a network initiative between, right now I think there's 10 organizations in the steering committee: the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund, VBSR. You guys know what the VBSR is? Yeah. I start to fall into the Vermont acronyms and realize that was not as well. Vermont Council on Rural Development, Recovery Vermont, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. There's more. And the idea is like thinking through, because a lot of times when you think about some of the socialists, or even the peace things you were talking about, right? When you get into, you start looking at the root causes. You know, when you start to peel back the onion about a lot of the issues, or so many of the issues we're facing, it kind of comes down to like the structure of the economy and what's incentivized. And so the idea with the Vermont Prosperity Project is, how do we start thinking about creating an economy centered around like human well-being versus just like money flows in the economy, right? Because GDP, which is kind of the big measure that people throw around, is really, it's values neutral. So basically you spend money on cancer treatment, that's a positive in GDP. Is it really though? So it's trying to think differently about how we measure the economic success. Oh, sorry, here's the group that I was trying to remember. So it's thinking through like, how do we think about creating an economy centered on that kind of thinking versus just moving money around in the economy. And we had it's related to this, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which are too many to mention. I'm not in the UN, but I'm like 17.
It's a nice round number, isn't it?
Prime number, isn't it? But I think the point is it's like, you know, here's this little state of Vermont, small but mighty, that has some. I think what I've heard about, you know, in Vermont is like the best thing about Vermont is like everybody knows everybody, but the worst thing about Vermont is everybody knows everybody. So it's like you can, if people are really accessible, I've noticed. That said, we also have, you know, there's certain networks that are kind of closed is the wrong word, but they might not have connections to another network. Like, you know, historically marginalized group, for example, you know, you have a network over here that's doing this great work, but they're not connected with that network. And so there's a missing connection there. So I think the opportunity in Vermont is to like think differently about the economy. And I think they're using the UN Sustainable Development Goals because these are things that governments globally are thinking about. So we had, I don't want to talk too much because I was going to talk about this. We had a kickoff in April with Kate Raworth, that she did something called donut economics, which is basically the green middle of the donut is where we're functioning sustainably. And if you're below that, if you're in the hole of the donut, you're not meeting people's needs. But if you're beyond the donut, you're basically overshooting. This is an example of some of the analysis that she's done. And so we're kind of the Vermont Prosperity Project specific to Vermont is thinking about how do we start to map what's happening in Vermont against these metrics to see how we're doing. The good news in Vermont is the good news in Vermont is that we actually have, you can see this online, the outcomes of well-being scorecard that was passed. I want to say I think it was 2014, Act 186. And we actually created a scorecard about well-being metrics. It's not 100% there, I was on a call a few years ago with the team that does it with Keisha Ram, and the data can't be disaggregated by region or by socioeconomic status, which is actually really important, but it's a step in the right direction. And when you come back to the Vermont Prosperity Project, the next steps is to kind of come up with a report to figure out, like, okay, how's Vermont doing on these metrics? And then a roadmap to think about, you know, can we have a new kind of legislation that actually forces the economy, the legislature and the government to think about these things longer term. And people have done it. So we had the Vermont Prosperity Project had Sophie Howe, who was the first Minister of Future Generations in Wales. She visited Vermont a few weeks ago and spoke to members of the legislature and also spoke to UVM about how they did it in Wales. And it's pretty interesting. I think Amanda might talk about that. So the point is that governments have done this. And it's kind of, for me as an individual, it's a little bit of one of those aha moments where, you know, shouldn't government be thinking longer term? But when you look at the structure, it doesn't support that, right? You know, we have a 1-year budget cycle, we have a 2-year term, right, in Vermont. And then at the federal level, there's other factors at play. So when you think about a piece of legislation, it actually makes the legislature think longer term. It's kind of interesting. So that's that. I think there's any other UVM things that might be interesting.
The question.
Yeah.
We published the Williston Observer, and one of the services that we've been benefiting from UVM is the community news service. And and that's part of, is it the Rural Studies Department?
Center for Rural Studies. Yeah,
Center for Rural Studies. So this is students who are writing stories about various communities and things in Vermont, and really assisting a lot of these smaller newspapers who don't necessarily have huge reporting or editorial staff, and allowing far more stories to come out. And some of them are initiated by the students or maybe the center, and some of them are initiated by the newspaper asking, hey, we would like a student to report on this topic. So is that related to what you're doing?
This is back to my comment about UVM being like
Yeah.
Sort of. I mean, we're in the same institution, but it's kind of a different office.
Mm-hmm.
That said, you know, we know about Richard's service. We know how valuable it is. And the Institute for Rural Partnerships could actually be a tool to give more resources to that effort, right? So if there's, because usually, to your point, you have these small publications that, you know, mostly volunteer led, right? They don't have a budget to pay anybody. And I'm not sure where Richard gets his funding. But if there was a grant, if there was an opportunity for Richard to basically expand his services to other newspapers with additional student reporters, that would be something that the Leahy Institute would be able to fund. So in that regard, it's like related. And it's also something, back to the point about the Office of Engagement and kind of like being around Vermont and making connections. That's usually what we're doing. So when I'm going to meetings, I haven't done Rotary meetings before, but I've done other kind of small group meetings with people from an area. And it's really a lot of listening to what people are working on, you know, like, because that's the thing, is like UVM is so big. You know, I go visit a company or I go visit a municipal government, and they're talking about, well, this is our biggest problem, or we need help with this, or this is what we're working on. And I'm kind of like, oh, you should talk to so-and-so at UVM. Sometimes it's student internships, right? And I get them connected to the career center or whoever's in the right school or college. Sometimes it's research. And we try to get them connected to the right faculty member if they need new knowledge. But yes, so in a way, from a way, our office is kind of, it's almost like I keep going back to some of my private sector experience. It's almost like lead generation for UVM, right? You're talking to people and you're thinking about what are they working on, what do they need help with, and then you're trying to make connections with the UVM resource. So we try to be, the challenge is really is, you know, how does a small office like ours really know like all the things going on at UVM? It's really impossible, frankly, you know, you can't. But you can, you're constantly, you know, having conversations internally as well as externally, because, you know, a new faculty gets hired that has an expertise in who knows what. How do you even know that? So there's it's a lot of conversations internally too. That's one thing I've noticed. That's different from the private sector.
So two questions. One, speaking of the let's call it all the pigeonholes at UVM. Do you coordinate at all with medical students? Because they have some emphasis on community service projects.
Yeah. You know, the medical school is interesting because it's such a behemoth by itself that it has a lot of that infrastructure to do that work. That it's almost like, to your point, it's almost like its own entity.
Yeah.
Do we interface? Sure. Do we interface as often as, like, say, the College of Engineering and Mathematical Sciences? No, because they have some of their own kind of infrastructure. It's like there's a website on the UVM site. I think it's called Academy of Data, something like that. It's actually accessible to the public, and you can look at student population and you can look at faculty researchers by schools and colleges. And I remember I looked at a graph once, and it was all the different schools and colleges, and I think the LCOM, which is Larner College of Medicine, was like 4 times as big as the next largest school. So they have almost like their own. And I think our VP of Research, Kirk, would be better at this, but I believe that the majority of our research funding is through the College of Medicine too.
No.
You know, NIH.
So that brings me to the second question, and that is, do you encounter a lot of duplication of either services or projects or?
You know, I don't know if I've necessarily encountered it. I think there's definitely overlap because of the different schools and colleges, and because of their different focuses, and because of what I talked about with the social networks in Vermont.
Yeah.
I think there are times when, you know, there's certain people have their own relationships with people in an organization. And then there's another part of the university that has their own relationships with maybe the same organization. And do they overlap and coordinate? Sometimes, but sometimes not, and sometimes that's okay. You know, I don't think it's, I haven't been exposed to an issue, or at least it hasn't come across my plate, which doesn't mean it hasn't happened, where like somebody was reaching out to a company or an organization where somebody else had a relationship and it turned into like a problem or anything. In many ways, I think it's probably appreciated by, depending on how the asks are made, right? Where you're getting maybe an engineering professor reaching out to the engineering team, and then you have maybe somebody from the career center talking to HR, and then maybe you have somebody from medical school talking to, you know, depending on what the company does, maybe they make medical devices and they're helping them. So have those multiple points of contact can be nice. What I would like, this is the pie in the sky dream from a just understanding the university, is having some kind of a way to just be aware of those connections. Because getting back to my point about like UVM's impact, I think we have way more connections than we just know about, because the university is so big. And it's just, it's just too much. So I feel like that would be an interesting resource for, as a land grant university and as a citizen, I have this idea, like, wouldn't it be cool if there was almost like a publicly accessible map where you could actually see all the ways that UVM is connecting with these different organizations, and, you know, kind of, you know, click into a town and be like, oh, wow, you know, they did a data report for Hardwick, and they did an internship with so-and-so. I know in Vermont, people are very, at least in my experience, there's a lot of identity with the counties and the regions. So I think that's important to be able to share that.
Sounds like a student intern project.
It's just like, this is the nerd part of me, is like, how would you actually gather that data? That's the hard part, is like getting people to share that
You
information.
wouldn't have to figure that out. You could tell a student.
Or maybe two students.
Like a lot of institutions, the bigger they grow, the less interconnection there is between things. There's always a criticism of UVM that they put all their money in administration and not so much in faculty and all. But you're talking about something that I would think the university could really benefit from, is some department or organization or something there that really does have that kind of umbrella look to it. I mean, there really are lots of resources that could coordinate with each other.
Yeah.
I'm assuming they don't have that at this point.
It's kind of informal, you know, we have an office, and I'm sure Patty Prelock, our provost, would have more insight into this, because she's been at the institution for 20 years. There isn't an office of institutional research which gathers some of that, the information I was just talking about with like the different schools and colleges. You can actually go in there too. There's another data set where you can see where in Vermont UVM students come from. So you can parse it by county, and then you can break it out by a major and stuff. It doesn't, there's no personal information, of course, but it's just numbers. It's really interesting to see that, actually. But yeah, I think there's an opportunity there. I think part of it too is, I think, you know, there's also, I think universities are kind of meant to be that way, right? As kind of an intellectual holding pen. You know, they're meant to be kind of like people doing all kinds of different things. So I think there's always that tension, right, between like coordination and like, what's the word I'm looking for? Diffusion. Maybe that's the word. But there's always a tension there, which is good, I think.
Well, thank you, and that was very interesting.
Oh.
Yeah, well, it is interesting to learn more about how the institution of UVM touches so many aspects of the state and brings value, and I can see that's well worth investing more in.
And
Communicate, not only creating it, but communicating.
And this is part of the work, really, is being out in, so thank you to Ellie for inviting me, but being out connecting with people. And now I'm here, you know, if you have a question about UVM.
There you
We
go.
know who to call. All right, we have one little task for you.
Me?
Yes, to please draw a raffle ticket.
Pass that around.
No,
Was it worth it?
oh,
147.
we not made one.
Anybody?
No.
Couple people left.
Oh, 147.
It's fixed. That was not. Best class ever.
Yeah. Right, you stick together.
Find it all in place. Before we move on,
Thank you for coming in and speaking with us today, where we will make a donation in your name to the Williston Central School Connecting Youth Mentoring Program. Thanks for coming.
before we get into our fines, we've got a little coordination on Saturday's Veterans Day event.
Yes, thanks, Susan. So show of hands. For our veterans, how many there? I'm taking names. Okay, if I get this side,
And then online, I'm seeing Barb,
okay.
which probably means Marty too.
Yeah, that's right.
Well,
These are
Chris,
checkers.
all right, I think that that's helpful.
I'll get the canopy, excuse me.
Okay,
I'll pick it
so
up.
we're headed there. How many people who are coming are willing to lend talent or physical labor to help pull the event off? And we're generally looking at a time frame. Some people beginning at 8 And probably ending about 90 people. Thank you for your patience. We got you. Cool. So more info to come. We're gonna coordinate, and you will likely get an email assigning you a task, but among the tasks, include coming to the church, helping pick up some chairs, helping transport them to the town hall, setting them up, working with Eric to get the podium and the flag from the town hall offices outside and setting up the speakerphone. We may need some talent. The talent includes standing up, and the agenda includes the Pledge of Allegiance, so someone would nicely be asked to just start that off. Hopefully not a lot of heavy lifting. And Phil has a presentation of names of people in the bricks, and we will be reading the names of people who have also served in Williston. So you may be asked to do a little bit of reading of some names, etc. Thank you, everybody. The short and sad news is, and I've already done the mea culpa and the embarrassing confession. So here goes to everybody. I just discovered 2 days ago that I'm gonna be on a plane on Saturday at 6 a.m. So I'm not gonna be here at 8 o'clock. So all this stuff, so I'm thanking you in advance for all your volunteer efforts and coordination, and it's gonna be a great event, and I'm really sorry to miss it. And if I paid more attention to where I'm supposed to be, my wife would appreciate it.
Yeah,
So
did you
I
still
apologize.
want people to bring some baked goods?
Yes, you were already signed up to do that. I think we're covered with you and Leslie.
And Barb, I
and
think.
Barb.
was- yeah.
Okay, I think we're good on that. And so please look for an email in the next 24 hours-ish with an assignment, and thank you all in advance.
And we'll be bringing coffee as well.
Yeah, we can, I'll talk with you after the meeting. Thank you for the time.